What if the quietest person in the room isn't the weakest one in it, but the one who has already fought a war no one else could see? We've all met someone like this. They don't raise their voice. They don't explain themselves. They don't perform. And somewhere along the way, we decided that meant they had nothing to offer. But Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most radical minds in the history of philosophy, believed something almost the opposite. He believed that silence, real silence, is sometimes the loudest evidence of a battle already won. By the end of this video, you may never look at a quiet person the same way again. Because what looks like emptiness on the outside is sometimes the sound of a mind that has learned to stop bleeding in public. Stay with me. Friedrich Nietzsche did not live a loud life. He was sick for most of it, isolated for much of it, misunderstood for almost all of it. He wrote in the margins of a world that didn't want to listen. And today, over a century later, that world can't stop quoting him. He wasn't interested in comfort. He was interested in truth, the kind of truth that doesn't care whether you're ready for it. And one of the truths hiding inside his philosophy is this: the loudest people in a room are not always the strongest. Sometimes they are the most afraid of what silence would reveal. This video is not a biography, it's an interpretation, one way of reading Nietzsche's ideas and applying them to something almost every one of us has felt: the ache of being underestimated because we don't perform our strength out loud. Picture a classroom, a boardroom, a family dinner. There is always one person who barely speaks, and almost instantly, without evidence, a story gets written about them. He must be shy. She must be insecure. He probably has nothing to say. We built a culture that mistakes a volume for value. The person who fills a silence gets remembered. The person who allows a silence to exist gets forgotten, or worse, dismissed. But watch closely, and you'll notice something uncomfortable. The people rushing to fill every silence are often the ones most terrified of what might surface if they stop talking. Nietzsche spent his life dismantling comfortable illusions, the ones society builds so it doesn't have to look at itself. And one of those illusions is this: that expression equals strength and restraint equals weakness. He believed the opposite could just as easily be true, that the ability to hold a feeling, to sit inside your own intensity without needing an audience for it, could be a form of discipline most people never develop. Not every quiet person is doing this. Some are simply shy. Some are in pain. But some, and this is the version we're exploring today, have made a quiet, private decision. I will not perform myself for people who haven't earned the right to witness me. Here is where we have to be precise, because this is where most people get it wrong. There are two silences, and they look almost identical from the outside. The first is the silence of fear, the voice that stays swallowed because speaking feels dangerous. This silence shrinks a person. It's the silence of someone editing themselves into invisibility, terrified of being seen wrong, seen weak, seen at all. The second is the silence of mastery, a stillness that is chosen, not forced. This is a person who could speak, who has plenty to say, but has learned that not every reaction deserves a response, and not every provocation deserves their energy. Nietzsche wrote extensively about the difference between reacting and creating your own values from within. A person ruled by fear is reacting to the world, flinching at it, shaped by what others think. A person practicing self-mastery is authoring their own responses, deciding deliberately what deserves their voice and what doesn't. The tragedy is that both silences look the same on a crowded subway, in a quiet meeting, at a family gathering where one person just doesn't say much. But one silence is a cage, the other is a fortress. The question worth asking about the quiet person across from you is not, why aren't they talking? It's, what does their stillness cost them to maintain? Fear costs nothing.
Calm. Maintain. It's the default. Mastery costs everything. It's built. At the center of Nietzsche's philosophy sits an idea he called self-overcoming, the belief that a human being is not a fixed thing, but something to be continually fought for, shaped, and outgrown. He imagined life as a kind of internal battlefield, not a war against other people, a war against your own weaker impulses, your resentments, your need for approval, your instinct to explain yourself to people who were never going to understand you anyway. For Nietzsche, greatness wasn't handed to anyone. It was carved, slowly, out of resistance, out of a person's willingness to confront exactly the parts of themselves that are the hardest to face. Here is the connection to silence. The person doing this internal work rarely has the energy or the desire to also perform outward. Self-overcoming happens in private. It happens in the version of you that exists when no one is watching, when no one is applauding, when there is no external reward for choosing discipline over indulgence. So when you meet someone who says little, who doesn't defend every opinion, who lets an insult pass without flinching, you might be looking at someone who has already spent their words on a battle you never saw. The version of them sitting in front of you isn't the raw material, it's what survived the forging. This doesn't mean every silent person has done this work. It means that when it has been done, silence is often the visible residue of it. There's a pattern worth noticing in people who have genuinely worked on themselves. They get quieter, not louder, as their confidence grows. Early in life, most of us try to prove ourselves. We over-explain. We defend our choices to people who never asked. We chase the last word in every argument because losing it feels like losing ourselves. But something shifts in people who've done real inner work. They stop needing to win every exchange. They stop needing witnesses to their worth. Their sense of self stops depending on being understood by everyone in the room. This is not coldness, it's economy. They've learned that most conflicts don't need their voice, they need their patience. That most insults reveal more about the person throwing them than the person receiving them. That explaining yourself to someone determined to misunderstand you is a kind of self-betrayal. Nietzsche often distinguished between values imposed from the outside and values a person builds from within, through struggle. A person still governed by outside opinion needs constant validation, needs to argue their worth into existence, out loud, again and again. A person who has built their values internally doesn't need the argument anymore. The case has already been made, to themselves, by themselves, in the years no one was watching. That's why the boardroom's quietest voice sometimes carries the most weight when it finally speaks. Scarcity creates value. Silence, used deliberately, is a kind of currency. If you're enjoying this journey into philosophy, take 1 second to like this video and subscribe. It helps us continue bringing timeless wisdom to millions of people. Picture a man in his late 20s. Call him Daniel. He sits at the end of the conference table, the same seat every week, saying almost nothing while louder colleagues perform confidence they don't quite have. Meetings end, decisions get made. Somehow, his name is rarely in the room when credit gets handed out. At home, it's not much different. Family dinners move around him like a current around a stone. His opinions, when he offers them, arrive short and unadorned, and get swallowed by everyone else's noise. For years, Daniel absorbed a quiet, corrosive belief that his silence was a defect, something to apologize for. He started rehearsing small talk in the car before walking into rooms, forcing enthusiasm that felt like wearing someone else's coat. Then, slowly, something changed. Not an event, but an accumulation. He began reading in the evenings instead of scrolling. He began sitting with his own discomfort instead of numbing it. He began asking himself a brutal question. Am I quiet because I'm afraid, or because I haven't yet decided what's worth my voice? The honest answer at first stung. Much of his silence had been fear wearing a disguise. So he did the harder thing. He didn't force himself to become loud. That would have been another
kind of performance. Instead, he practiced precision. He started speaking only when he had something the room actually needed. He stopped over-explaining his decisions. He stopped apologizing for opinions he actually believed. At first, almost no one noticed. Then, gradually, they did. Not because Daniel got louder, but because when he did speak, people realized he hadn't wasted a single one of the last 20 times he hadn't. His stillness stopped looking like absence. It started looking like restraint. Colleagues who once talked over him began pausing, almost instinctively, before he spoke, the way a room goes quiet before something that matters. He never became arrogant. He never needed the room to notice him. That had been the whole shift. But the room noticed anyway, because respect has a way of finding people who stopped chasing it. Daniel didn't become someone else. He became more precisely himself, and the world, slowly, adjusted its assumptions to match. This isn't a call to become silent for the sake of appearing mysterious. That's just another performance, a quieter one, but a performance nonetheless. Here is the practice, distilled. First, notice the difference between your two silences. When you don't speak, ask yourself honestly, is this restraint or is this fear?
You cannot build strength on top of a lie about which one it is. Second, spend less energy explaining yourself to people who've already decided not to understand you. Not every silence needs to be filled. Not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. Third, let your actions accumulate before your words do. Nietzsche believed a person's values had to be earned through struggle, not announced through declaration. Speak from what you've already built, not to convince yourself it's there. And finally, don't confuse this with coldness toward the people who matter to you. Self-mastery was never meant to isolate you from connection. It was meant to make the connection you do offer more honest, because it isn't coming from a need to be liked. It's coming from a self that no longer needs permission to exist. Nietzsche never promised comfort. He promised confrontation, with yourself first, before anyone else. And maybe that's the real lesson hiding inside every quiet person you've ever underestimated. Their silence isn't always a void waiting to be filled. Sometimes it's a room they built for themselves, one where they finally stopped needing you to understand them in order to know exactly who they are. Not every quiet person is fighting this battle, but some are. And if you are one of them, the ones the world keeps mistaking for smaller than you are, know this: mastery has never needed an audience to be real. If this video changed the way you see silence, leave a like, subscribe, and comment. Silence is my strength. I'd love to hear your thoughts.